Thank you for being a part of this year's virtual E2 conference. This theme is certainly worth our time and attention because if there's ever been an era in which strong church leaders are needed, today is the day. And one of the challenges that comes with trying to be a strong leader is that we equate strong leadership with being in control. But sometimes strong leadership requires knowing when and to whom we should submit. And so today I'd like to share some thoughts with you from Luke chapter 5, where the Apostle Peter, a man gifted by God for leadership, had to learn this lesson, that leadership sometimes requires knowing when to surrender control. One day as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken, and so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. In this familiar text, we can see some important lessons that you and I as spiritual leaders need to be reminded of in order to serve strongly and well in such trying times. Leadership seems on the surface to be about gaining and maintaining control. But as this text reminds us, spiritual leadership requires knowing when and to whom we should submit. In this text, Peter learns that it is important to submit to Jesus, even when what he asks seems simple. Sometimes we as leaders tend to make the work of God and the voice of God more complicated than needed. And that's one of the challenges that surfaces in this text. If you notice, as I was reading the text, the whole story begins with Jesus teaching the people. And that's no big surprise. The surprise in the text comes when Jesus goes over and gets into Simon Peter's boat and asks Peter to row his boat out away from the shore. The text seems to start innocently as Jesus shifts his teaching location to the middle of the water and Peter's boat. But Peter isn't in the driving position. It's Jesus who's in the driver's seat. And so we see from this part of the text that it's good for leaders to surrender to Jesus even when what Jesus asks seems simple. Like you, I really want to be a world changer. That's what I signed up for when I signed up for Christian leadership. And because I want to be a world changer, sometimes I don't want to be a tire changer or a light bulb changer or a diaper changer. But God can work through the changing of a diaper, a tire, or a light bulb to change the world. And if He can change the world through the borrowing of a boat, following and submitting to Jesus, even when what He asks seems simple, may be the key to our leadership as well. But the text moves on. When Jesus finishes His teaching, it may seem as if He's done speaking. But in many ways, the centerpiece of this passage is found in what comes next. Jesus, once again, for the second time now in this passage, instructs Simon Peter, this time telling him to row the boat out into deep waters for a fishing expedition. And once again, I know that it is Peter who was sitting at the oars, but it sure seems like it's Jesus who's in the driver's seat. And that's where we see the second leadership lesson in this passage, that it's good for leaders to submit to Jesus, not only when what He asks seems simple, but also when what He asks seems surprising. Peter notes what's surprising about this request from Jesus. Master, he says, we have worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. Peter is the person who appears to be the expert on fishing. And yet, in this text, he says to Jesus, this makes no sense to me. But because you say so, I will obey. Amazing things happen in the Lord's church when spiritual leaders are willing to say, Lord, this makes no sense to me, but because you say so. What happens next is an amazing object lesson in leadership, both for Peter and for us. It's the wrong time of day to fish. And yet, when Peter lets down the nets, in come the fish, down go the boats, and down falls Peter. He tries to fall at the feet of Jesus, but he can only make it to Jesus' knees because there are too many fish in the way. And Peter, in humility, responds to Jesus by saying, Lord, this is too much for me. I am a sinful man. It's no surprising thing when God uses our areas of weakness to keep us humble. But some of the most striking and memorable humility lessons leaders learn are in those moments when God takes our so-called expertise and our apparent abilities, and He uses those gifts as an opportunity to humble us. Peter discovered something you and I as leaders need to remember. It is important to submit to what Jesus says, even when what He asks seems simple. But it's also important to submit to what Jesus says when what he asks seems surprising. And yet, in verse 11, we learn a third leadership lesson. And that is that it is important for leaders to submit to what Jesus says, even when what he asks seems sacrificial. When you take Jesus' statement at the end of verse 10, from now on you will fish for people, it doesn't really seem all that dramatic. But the implications of that statement are actually found in verse 11. So Peter and his companions pull their boats up on shore, leave everything, and follow Jesus. This text begins with an empty fishing boat. The text ends with empty fishing boats. And it might be easy to conclude that since the boat is empty again, nothing's really changed. But for Peter, everything had changed. The entire direction and focus of his life had changed. And that meant sacrifice. Leadership always does. And so it's important to submit to Jesus, even when what he asks seems sacrificial. That when we are leading in challenging times, our first and primary responsibility isn't to stand up and take charge. It's to lead the way by submitting to the one in whose name and for whose sake we are leading in the first place. Leaders have to speak, but before they speak, leaders must learn to listen. And as Peter discovered in this text, that's a good thing for us and for those whom we lead.